So now that we've talked about the epidermis, so let's talk now about the layers of your epidermis. So as you can see, your dermis has two layers. Okay, we are done discussing your epidermis. So let's descend further down and talk about the dermis now. Let's talk about the dermis. So as you can see, your dermis has two layers to it. And again, it sits right below your epidermis. So your epidermis is the topmost layer of the skin that sits up here. And if you can recall, the bottommost layer of your epidermis is called your stratum basale. Now, let's talk about your dermis. So your dermis composed of the first layer, your papillary layer, and then below is the reticular dermis. So difference between the two is that your epidermis is the type of tissue we can have here. Recall that the epidermis has epithelial tissue. Then your dermis, we have something connective tissue. As you can see, it's different because it does not require cells. Epithelial requires columnar cells, even transitional, that can be seen in the bladder. Connective tissue has little of protein called as your Again, connective tissue has little of protein called as your actin. Let me write that one, actin. Or some sort of collagen, which is another structure protein, which includes your elastin and so forth. What is unique in the papillodermis is we have a connective tissue here. It characterized by thin, it must be thin, loose connective tissue. It is thin, loose connective tissue. That's very important characteristic of your papillary dermis, which allows movement around. It allows changes of your shape and movement. It's thin, loose, which allows movement of your changes and shape. That is in contrast to your reticular, which is more of thicker, denser connective tissue. So the purpose is to make things still. So you have to take note of this difference. It's thicker, it's denser connective tissue. In papillary, again, things move around, change position, change of your shape and movement. So one of the things you can see here is on the papillary is your blood vessels. Main thing you can see here is blood vessels and the arterial branches of your capillaries. Right here, capillaries. And when they come back together, they make a venule obviously that goes up to a particular vein. So that's the superficial part. So the role of the capillaries delivers your oxygen. That's the role of your capillaries. Delivers oxygen and nutrients to nourish your dermis and goes up to the epidermis as well. Because epidermis obviously has no blood vessels. They rely entirely on the papillary dermis to nourish. And thanks that it's thin and loose, connective tissue will allow changes and movement. So these nutrients can diffuse and goes up to the top from the dermis to epidermis and even go lower if necessary. The only thing we have in our dermis is of course your nerve endings. These nerve endings that sit on the dermis allows us to perceive things like your touch and even pain. And that will pass on a signal across the nerve like here and that, and the signal relates all the way to a cell body and consists further away the skin. So as we get to the reticular dermis, which is important, why it's thicker, it's denser, connective tissue itself anchor things, it allows anchor things down, and one of the things you can have here, some sort of ascends to the epidermis. This is actually a gland, a tons of sweat glands, exocrine glands. A lot of varieties that start on the reticular dermis that anchored in down here extend to a duct to secrete their content to the epidermis, to the outside world, the top layer of the skin. So you get plenty of glands that sit here. So in addition, you have this follicle right here. So this follicle will permit an emerging hair. So this is a hair, will protrude on the top of your skin, protrude on the top of your skin. So that is your hair. And this, take note of this, class. This is your hair. This is your hair follicle, which is anchored to your reticular dermis, which allows to grow and extend out to the top and protrude on the skin. We have something here that is anchored or connected to the hair follicle, which is actually a muscle. This is what you call as your, what do you call this, class? A rector pili muscle. It's a rector pili muscle with a letter A. A rector pili muscle which is involved in extending or having your hair stands up. That's literally your goosebump. The process is called as your piloerection. This happens when you're cold or scared or when you are emotionally tense. And finally, we can move to the last layer, which is your hypodermis. There are actually two main layers of your skin, your epidermis and your dermis. Hypodermis is not part of the layers of the skin. It's technically not a skin, so not part of the layer. Hypodermis, which is a great name. Hypo means below, which sits below the dermis. Its other name is subcutaneous fats. There's a lot or tons of layers of fats that could vary from person to person. So this is important because it has two main functions. Yes, it has functions. First, it absorbs your shock. It absorbs shock. So people that are more insulated with fat are able to stand. They can stand more of your traumatic injuries because they are more insulated with fat. So other thing it does for us is insulates our tissue. It insulates our tissue. What can be found below your hypodermis, of course, some sort of muscle sits down here, or even bone as well. Muscles and your bone. But the question is, but how doctors actually diagnose diseases? But how doctors clinically diagnose diseases? The best one to talk about here is for the diagnosis, class. Best one to talk about here is the diagnosis of your burns. That's how physicians or doctors clinically diagnose. So best one to talk about here is for the diagnosis of your burn. Burn is a horrible thing that could happen to a person. So it's important to determine what degree the burn you sustained, and it's interesting enough, class, that the different layers of the skin correspond to the different degree of burn you can have. You can have first degree burn, which is some sort of reddening that occurs, of course, on the epidermis layer. You can have second degree burn, which is characterized by burning the dermis, so much so that you don't have nerve pain after some time. That's the difference between first degree. First degree hurts awfully, but if no pain, this area are involved because they are killed off nerve tissue, there will be no signal, so the dermis is affected. And finally, your third degree, which is past to the hypodermis, your muscle, your bone, it is characterized by not having pain, darker color, because you're not just burning more of your connective tissue, but actually burning muscle, bones as well. And this exactly allows medical professional to distinguish degree of what? Degree of